Wow, it's so exciting to see so many people come to talk about, or hear someone talk about data and evidence and statistics. I would never have figured it. My name is Raphael Bostic. I'm a professor here at USC in the Price School, and I'm the director of the Bedrosian Center for Governance in the Public Enterprise. I'd like to welcome you here today for the 2013 Holt Lecture. I want to say a little bit about the Bedrosian Center because many of you may not have heard about it. Our center is an applied research center with the goal of lifting up issues around the implementation of policy. And we're really interested in making and improving the implementation of policy and helping the public sector, nonprofits, and the private sector all come together to get better outcomes and improve people's lives. We are here thanks to the gift, a generous gift by John and Judith Bedrosian. John's here in the front. Please join me in acknowledging him. John, thank you so much. Now, one of the things that we do is help put together the Dennis F. and Brooks Holt Distinguished Lecture series. And this is a Price School event that was established by one of the board of counselors of the school, Dennis Holt, and his wife, Brooks. This series is designed to invite prominent practitioners, influential policymakers, and visiting scholars to discuss the key issues around the connections and interactions between communications and policy. And the speaker today definitely falls into that category of bringing the communication of policy and using data and evidence to shape how we think about policy and politics. And so it will be a great day indeed. I want to just thank Dennis Holt. Dennis is here as well. Thank you, Dennis, for your generous support. Please join me. Now, I will see you a little later on after Nate's presentation. We're going to have a little conversation, then we'll go to question and answer. I would say if you have questions, we will ask you to come up, but I'll signal that when that is going to happen. But right now, what I'd like to do is introduce my boss, who is the Dean of the Price School of Public Policy, Jack Knott. Please join me in welcoming Jack.
Well, good morning, everyone. One thing you may not know about me is that for many years I was a professor at Michigan State University in the university town of East Lansing, Michigan. Now, we like to say that there are three famous people who have come from that little town of East Lansing. The first is Magic Johnson, the Lakers NBA star. The second is Larry Page, the founder of Google. And the third is today's speaker, Nate Silver. Nate has distinguished himself as today's leading political analyst and statistician through the innovative and accurate analysis of political polling. He first gained notoriety, however, for his statistical analyses and forecasts of baseball games working for Baseball Prospectus. He then received significant national attention during the 2008 presidential race when he correctly predicted the winner of the presidency in 49 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. He didn't get Indiana right for some reason, I don't know why. He also correctly predicted the winners of every U.S. Senate race. And the accuracy of his predictions, his straightforward approach to using public data, and the understandability of it for the average person won him great acclaim here and abroad. And he ended up appearing in the Washington Post and on television news with Dan Rather and many other opportunities. Nate then founded the award-winning political website 538.com, where he published a widely read running forecast of current elections and hot-button political and policy topics. And in 2010, the blog became a highly popular part of the website for the New York Times. He uses a model that combines electoral history, demographics, and polling. He has published forecasts and analyses for presidential races, Senate and House races, and gubernatorial races. And now his new book, The Signal and the Noise, Why Most Predictions Fail, But Some Don't, is a tour of modern prediction science, uncovering a surprising connection between humility, uncertainty, and good results. He's been named to Time's list of 100 most influential people and Rolling Stone's 100 agents of change. Now, it turns out that my family knows his family. My son Alex, here today, is in the audience, was in the same East Lansing High School as Nate's younger sister, Rebecca, and Nate's father, Brian Silver, former chair of the political science department and a statistician in his own right at Michigan State University, is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. Brian emailed me earlier this week to let me know that Nate was supposed to be at a family reunion right now in Maine, but chose to come to speak to the students, faculty, and staff at USC instead. So we are indeed thankful and thrilled to have Nate here today to give our Holt Distinguished Lecture. Please join me in giving a warm USC and Trojan family welcome to Nate Silver. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. If you knew my family, you knew it wasn't that hard a choice to make, really. I'm just kidding. But I do come from East Lansing. I feel as though, due to our mutual hatred of Notre Dame, we probably have a lot in common. Although Michigan State's last Rose Bowl appearance was, I think, a 20-17 victory over USC. It was also 25 years ago, but I digress. So I'm here to talk to you today about data and statistics and the way they're being used in the world today, and what happens when you take a society and infuse a lot more information into it. Is that information used to better society, or is it misconstrued sometimes? Is there more noise than signal? So let me give you a bit of historical context first. I'm just old enough, I'm 35, where when I grew up in the 1980s, Detroit Tigers were very good. You actually had to, if you didn't see the game on TV, wait for the newspaper to come out in the morning to see how they did. But now, all that information, of course, for many years has been available online. You've gone from the World Wide Web only being invented in 1990 to now about 400 million, not web pages, but different web domains that are run every day. So a vast increase in the amount of information at your fingertips. But there have been other points in human history where you had a similar paradigm shift in the availability of information and data. Maybe the most notable one being in 1440 AD, when the printing press was invented. So not to go on too much of a digression about ancient European history, but bear with me for a second. Before the printing press was invented, it cost about $25,000 to produce a single copy of a book. You basically had to hire some dude to hand transcribe every character in the book, and it would take him perhaps 6 months to a year of his time. So not a very efficient means to record and disseminate knowledge. Perhaps you would have some type of great idea or invention, but if it costs $25,000 per copy of that idea, then it's not going to be remembered by the next generation in all probability. So very slow growth in technology, very slow economic growth. People might not realize that standards of living did not really improve worldwide between the time of the Romans and the Industrial Revolution in 1775 or so. The human condition, lifespans were not improving at all because people didn't have the technology to actually record ideas and build up a store of information and knowledge. But the printing press would change that and be very beneficial in the long run. It went from costing $25,000 to produce a book to about $250 instead. So still kind of expensive, but enough that key ideas were written down and texts were distributed and ideas were debated. And you see how fast this technology sped throughout Europe. So just one city in Germany in 1450, and then all throughout the continent 50 years later. But there were also some unintended consequences when people had a lot more information, a lot more data than they had been used to seeing before. So if you only have a few books, people might agree on some common ideas. They might read the Bible, if they read it all. They might read the Greek philosophers, but probably not a lot more than that. And when you have only one set of ideas in the marketplace, the ideas might be completely wrong But you do have consensus for better or worse within a community. Now all of a sudden you have a disruptive technology, you have competition of different ideas, particularly among different religious traditions in Europe. So the Protestant Reformation, for example, was well timed to the origin of the printing press, because now Martin Luther, instead of just preaching in a church, could go and distribute 200,000 copies of his theses around Europe. So people, a lot of new ideas, a lot of religious ideas in particular, and what happens? Well, people begin to fight over these ideas a lot. And in fact, if you look at the first 100 years in Europe after the printing press, it was the bloodiest century in European history, at least until the 20th century came along. All because people are reading now and debating ideas, and so often when you have a disruptive technology, it takes a while for people to figure out how to use it, so it's a step backward before you then take your 2 or 3 or more steps forward instead. So moving forward to the present day, there's a lot of excitement about this idea of big data, and certainly the volume of data is increasing exponentially. But sometimes I think people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves. This, for example, is an article written in 2008 by Chris Anderson, who was then the editor of Wired magazine. And his idea is that the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. So what's that mean? He's basically claiming that volume of data conquers everything else. That if you have millions and billions and trillions of observations, you can process them faster and faster. You don't need theory, you just solve everything with brute force. That somewhere in that huge database that you have, the kind of correlations will rain out from the cloud and explain everything sooner or later. I think this idea is actually quite wrong and even a little bit dangerous. But let me give you some context. First of all, think about when this was written in the summer of 2008. So this is a point in time when the entire global financial system is in the midst of melting down. Models in finance are very data-driven. The models on mortgage-backed securities, for example, use observations on, on millions of American mortgages. But you can have millions of data points and make 1 or 2 flawed assumptions and come out with a garbage in, garbage out model that would help to trigger the entire world economy collapsing. And likewise, looking back on the past, on the new millennium, I'm not a pessimist by any means, but it's not been the best time for Western civilization necessarily. Economic growth has been slow. You see a number of disasters. We can't prevent, for example, earthquakes. But there were some dubious use of statistics in Japan that theorized you couldn't actually have an earthquake as large as the one that actually occurred there 2 years ago. So for example, the Fukushima reactor was only built to withstand 8.5 earthquake. You had a 9.0 there instead, and that made the scope of the disaster much worse on a human scale. We not only have more volume of information, we also have a lot more speed of information today. There was recently, I guess back in April, a case where the Associated Press's Twitter feed was hacked. They sent out a single errant tweet that implied there had been some type of attack in the White House, that President Obama had been injured. On the basis of this one tweet that was not confirmed by the New York Times, the BBC, or the LA Times, or anyone else, the S&P 500 lost about $1.6 billion in market capitalization before recovering just a couple of minutes later. So if you were, for example, like a terrorist group and some Syrian group took credit for this later on, all you have to do now to fund your organization is hack the AP's Twitter feed. It's like AP123 is the password. Send out this tweet, call your broker on the dip, buy, and then you've made $1 billion or something just based on hacking someone's passwords. But this is actually, I think, people thought this dip was caused by automated trading algorithms instead, people trying to look for any glimmer of hope and information in real time. This is very new to have such high stakes bets, literally kind of billions of dollars of bets made on the basis of one tweet and then rescinded just a minute later, literally. So the big question here is, when will big data produce big progress? And I'm going to first articulate the problem, the reason why volume alone won't conquer everything, and then give you guys some best practices or suggestions for for attitudes and steps we can take to make improvement around the margin. And I should say this is actually not going to be an overly technical presentation. There are parts of it that are a little bit mathy, but not too much. A lot of this is more about the philosophy of science and statistics than about the actual technique. The technique can be learned, especially if you're motivated to solve a difficult problem. Also, these points will be fairly general in nature. This is based on the research I've done for my book, where I talk to people in 13 different subfields and some of my own experience and a couple more than that. So these are things that are relatively universal truths about working with data. Obviously, when you get into baseball or politics or national security, there are characteristics that are more specific to those fields. We can talk about those maybe in the Q&A, but these are general principles, I think. Let me first talk a little bit about the 538 election model last year, which got me a lot of notoriety, but really when you boil it down is quite simple. It's really just a three-step process where you're doing three things, taking an average of the polls, counting to 270, and then accounting for the margin of error. Let me explain what I mean by each of these. In election campaigns in the U.S., you have literally thousands of polls that are released during a presidential year. A lot of times, if you're looking at media coverage, it's the outlier polls that get the attention. So for example, if you would have had a poll saying that Mitt Romney was ahead in California because it's a bad polling firm or just a statistical fluke, it's probably a poll that you should, to a first approximation, ignore until you see some confirmatory evidence. But I'm sure Politico would have run a 40-point headline talking about the big shift in momentum in California and made way too much of it. So our goal instead is to find what the average or the central tendency is. The average, as simple as it is still the most useful statistical tool ever invented. There are some things at the margin that make this a better version of an average. For example, we want to remove partisan bias from polls. Some polling firms consistently have a Democratic or Republican lean. We can pull that right back out. That makes the data less noisy. Figuring out how much to adjust to new data. You don't want to overreact to a new poll. You don't want to underreact to it. So there's some art and science there. But it's a basic, fairly simple idea conceptually, taking the average and not looking at the outliers. The next idea is counting to 270, so that just means we contest elections here in the U.S. through the Electoral College, thinking about what combinations of states will produce a winning map for a candidate. And furthermore, what the relationship is between the vote in different states. So for example, Pennsylvania and Ohio are quite similar to one another demographically, geographically. They might move together more than, say, Colorado and Ohio would. So we can account for those relationships. But again, a pretty simple idea in theory about just looking for which states give you a winning map and which don't. The last idea is thinking in terms of the margin of error or in terms of probabilities. So I get credited sometimes for having called 50 out of 50 states right on election day last year. This was our map. But if you look at the fine print here, do I have a laser pointer? Oh, there you see. What you see is you actually have shades of gray, or really shades of red and blue in this case, where it wasn't that hard to figure out that Mitt Romney was going to lose California, but probably win Utah and Alabama. But Florida, we had Obama with a 50.1% chance of winning. So a coin flip to a first approximation. We get credit for that sometimes. I think people are sometimes not good intuitively at thinking in terms of probabilities. If you say 51%, they take that to mean 75%. If you say 75%, they take that to mean almost certain. But we are thinking in terms of how much uncertainty is there. When you're on election morning, nothing more can happen in the news. You have hundreds and hundreds of polls. You can make a very accurate forecast. You can't make a very accurate forecast, though, years or months in advance. Looking now at 2016, if you ask me, well, who's going to win in 2016? I'd say I have no clue. And that's the honest answer when you're looking so far out. So many things can and will occur. But again, nothing here that's all that conceptually difficult. And in fact, if you look at methods that were our competitors and, for example, Real Clear Politics, that you have an even simpler approach, just taking a straight average of the polls, no fancy math at all, they said the same thing. They said, well, Obama's ahead in Ohio in enough swing states where he's probably going to win. not that complex. But nevertheless, in politics, where the bar, I think, is pretty low and people are kind of Neanderthal in their understanding of numbers and data and empiricism, it's produced a lot of controversy. So you see here like a brag slide showing the Google search traffic for my name and for Vice President Biden's name. So this is actually an illustration of the Colbert bump. What happens when you go on Comedy Central 2 days in a row, you get briefly become more famous than the vice president. But I want to assure you that Americans kept their perspective during the election. This is the same metric for Justin Bieber during the election month last year, where Mr. the Biebs is still justifiably getting a lot more attention than the vice president of the United States. But why do these fights still persist in politics when in baseball kind of the Moneyball wars were resolved in kind of a truce roughly 10 years ago? It's partly because of the same problem we saw at the dawn of the printing press, where now you have hundreds of cable channels, you have thousands of blogs and media outlets, and people will consume sometimes a very jaded and biased subset of information. So looking, for example, at the demographics of some popular TV shows and news outlets, only about 1% of Rachel Maddow's audience are Republicans on a typical evening. Only about 5% of Sean Hannity's audience are Democrats. Again, there are certainly some news outlets that have a mainly partisan audience that are nevertheless fair and balanced, or however you want to put it. But there are others that aren't. I'm going to pick on one here. So the Drudge Report is a conservative-leaning website that tends to get a lot of traction in kind of Beltway media circles. So this is their homepage on November 6th, 2012 on election morning. So to give you kind of the 30-second recap of the election last year, you had Obama ahead pretty consistently by a small, persistent margin, about 2 or 3 points in the national polls in the swing states up through the conventions. At the convention, he went ahead by a wider margin. You had the 47% tape. Then you had the debate in Denver where Obama stunk, became very close for a while. But toward the end of the campaign, Obama was inching back ahead, opening up the margin a little bit more. He did well in the last 2 debates. Hurricane Sandy hit late in the year, seemed to help him out. He got the kind of Chris Christie bear hug. So if you had just, never mind taking an average, on election morning, if you had just counted all the polls that have been put together in the past week, so any poll in a key swing state showing Obama ahead, put it in the blue pile. Any poll showing Romney ahead, put it in the red pile. We're just counting, not that hard. You would have a blue pile that was about 5 times larger than the red pile. But this is what you get on the Drudge Report instead, where I've highlighted in red every poll or clip of news he cites that implies that Romney's going to win. In blue, he has just 2 token data points for Obama at the ABC Washington Post poll, and Obama in a landslide predicts Bob Dylan, right? So, but Bob Dylan it wasn't a landslide, but closer to being right than Matt Drudge. So the point here is, first of all, if you are relying on some news outlets, the amount of cherry picking that they do of the news it's quite startling when you frame it like this. But number 2, if you had read only this website, or perhaps only watched some Fox News shows, I think some of their shows present a more rounded news view than others, but you would have been very surprised on election night where Obama won more or less in accordance with what the polls would have said. You might have had a Karl Rove moment when Ohio was called for Obama. So I think it's worth making fun of people involved in politics, and this isn't always popular, but one of the things I say to student groups is I would recommend that you don't go into politics. I think our politics are so broken. We need people in the private sector, in the scientific world, to overcome our bad politics and for America to succeed in spite of them. But with that said, there are problems that people have in all types of fields when they're encountering a vast increase in the availability of data and information. One reason why is kind of mathematical, whereas when we're looking at data, what we really want to see is not just statistics for its own sake, not, oh, Dustin Pedroia is hitting 312 with runners in scoring position, but we want to see relationships and connections that allow us to make predictions, make better decisions going forward. We want to see those connections in the data. So as you have more and more data, however, you have an exponential increase in the complexity of relationships and the volume of relationships to look at. So if you have 5 variables, say the temperature in Los Angeles and ice cream sales, you have 10 relationships to look at. As you double the number of variables from 5 to 10, you've now well more than doubled. You have 45 relationships to look at instead. But you also have cases like this, where the Federal Reserve now tracks 148,000 economic variables in real time. This is a very useful website. But if you're looking at the data, you have a huge volume now of things to sort through. You have 10.9 billion correlations to evaluate. And believe me, this is a good database. There's some real insight there. But of those 10.9 billion, there are also a lot of spurious correlations. One infamous one involved the National Football League, which I know the National Football League is a major professional sports league. I know you guys don't have it anymore in Los Angeles, but the NFL and the Super Bowl, where for a number of years you had a streak where if the NFC team won Super Bowl, the stock market would have a good year. If the AFC team won instead, the stock market would have a bad year, be flat. So 2008, one of the best Super Bowls of all time, where the New York Giants came back to defeat the Patriots. David Tyree made that catch. So would have been a good omen for the stock market, right? The NFC comes back from behind and wins, but instead you had the biggest market collapse since the Great Depression. If you're betting on a correlation that doesn't have any real causal link, I guess no real reason why investors should be concerned about which football team wins, then you're likely to get burned sooner or later. And even when things occur for a long time, when you have 10.9 billion lottery tickets to play, you're going to have some extremely unlikely events occur from time to time. You get a lot of false positives as a result. So a couple more ways to look at the same thing, because this is such an important point where look, as you get more data, you have more truth, so to speak, an increase in true signals in the red, but you also have a wider increase in false positives and statistical correlations that don't have any meaning going forward. So we might be getting smarter, but our egos are growing faster than our actual knowledge, and that's pretty dangerous as human beings. When people are not thinking about what the risks might be when they set up something like, oh, the European currency or something like that, or invade foreign countries, to think when we get ahead of ourselves and how much we really know, then we get ourselves in trouble. So it might seem like, well, you have big data, but we're not so naive about it. We might know that, for example, the Super Bowl stock market correlation is BS, doesn't really hold water. So you're applying some type of filter instead, but you can still have a lot of false positives if you're not careful. So this is kind of another representation of the same idea, where what you have on the right here, you have your needles in the haystack. You have the insights that are real and meaningful, your true positive results, but it's a big universe of data, and so you have this vast universe of false positives instead. So, but you're smart, you apply some filtering methods, some algorithm, and now, for example, only 20% of your false positives get through. You prevent 80% of those instead. And likewise, you correctly detect 80% of your true signals. So you've made a lot of progress, but still, when you look at which ideas, which hypotheses passed your test, because you had so little underlying truth to begin with, your results are still dominated more by noise than signal, more by results that look very good in a statistical sense, but which don't actually apply going forward because you're drawing from such a big universe of data, such an unstructured search, that you have a lot to overcome. It's similar, by the way, to if you give mammograms to young women, or relatively young women in their 40s, fortunately the underlying risk of breast cancer for women in their 40s is very low. It's about 0.7% in the United States. So because the risk is so low, when you give women mammograms, the results are dominated by false positives. The vast majority of women in their 40s who have a positive mammogram actually don't have breast cancer because it's so hard, fortunately, to find real cases of this for young women. For that reason, the federal government recommends that you don't give women in their 40s mammograms at all unless they have other risk factors. The stress of having a false positive literally outweighs the very low risk of actually having a case of breast cancer when you have no other symptoms but a positive mammogram. Part of the issue is that as human beings, we're very much wired to detect signal. In New York, every 3-game, where's my water? In New York, every 3-game Yankees losing streak is an existential crisis in the New York Post. You look at stock market data, for example, where 2 of these are real stock market charts showing the value of the Dow Jones over a period of 5 years, but 4 are fakes. And there have been famous experiments where people will generate fake stock market charts and show them to top Wall Street analysts. They'll say, oh, buy this stock immediately. This stock is a dog. Sell this one, when they're just looking at random noise instead. By the way, D and F are the real ones. If you got that right, then I have some contacts at Goldman Sachs and CNBC. By the way, the reverse is true too. Sometimes people don't know what randomness really looks like. People think that random data always goes like 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, just kind of oscillates back and forth, when at random you'll have some long streaks in the data from time to time. You'll have weird things occur. If you're a sports fan, then you know this happens from time. You'll have a team that's not very much good win 8 games in a row. You'll have a number 12 seed advance to the Final Four. Sports fans get this, but people in other walks of life often do not. It might seem that if human beings are so disposed toward all these biases when looking at probabilities, when trying to understand what randomness really is, then why not turn things over to the computers instead? Aren't they unbiased? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. So I'll kind of give you a couple of metaphors here to explain why. So I'm not much of a chess player myself. I like games like poker where there's some element of randomness involved. But if you play chess, you might have an opinion on this position here. And what this is a position from the first game of the 1997 match between IBM's Deep Blue, the supercomputer. It plays the black pieces here, and the Russian chess champion Garry Kasparov, probably the best chess player of all time. So what's interesting here is that given the same data, both man and machine think they have an edge. They look at the same information in very different ways. So first Deep Blue. So in chess, there are ways to assign a point value to every piece on the board. So for example, a bishop is worth about 3 times as much as a pawn, or a queen is worth about 9 times as much. So you can kind of give yourself a score based on how many pieces you have left. And Deep Blue, doing this in this match, would say, I have the more valuable pieces. I have 30 points. Kasparov has 29. What's this guy thinking? I'm probably going to win. Kasparov has much less raw calculation power than Deep Blue. Deep Blue is evaluating hundreds of millions of chess moves per second. Kasparov would need literally his whole lifetime to do something like that. But his thinking is much more directed. That characteristic we talked about before, where sometimes we human beings overperceive patterns, can also help in a game like chess, where Kasparov very quickly perceives this problem for Deep Blue right here, where the objective in chess is actually not to accumulate pieces. The objective is to checkmate your opponent before your opponent checkmates you. Getting powerful pieces is just a means to an end. And Deep Blue has lost sight of the bigger picture in its brute force calculations. Kasparov has 3 pawns that are moving toward Deep Blue's unprotected king. He has a queen and a bishop that are also moving toward the same pressure point. So in fact, Deep Blue is in deep shit in this position here, and would go on and lose the game a handful of turns later. But it was not without another strange situation that occurred toward the end of the match. One good thing about computers, they don't have any pride, they don't get tired. So whereas a human being would have been like, man, I played that game like crap, I'm going to resign and go have a whiskey or something. Deep Blue will keep fighting on instead, hoping that Kasparov would make a mistake. But toward the very end of the match, Deep Blue made a move that Kasparov had trouble understanding. It moved its rook from the square labeled d5 to the square d1 instead. So it just seems kind of random. It accomplished no offensive objective, no defensive objective. It kind of wasted a turn when Deep Blue has a lot of threats it's dealing with from all sides. So just a really almost like a glitch or something. And Deep Blue would go ahead and resign the game, totally give up a couple of turns later. But Kasparov went back to his hotel that night and kind of thought about the position. He's like, look, I'm Garry Kasparov. I'm the best chess player in the world. I can think supposedly 15 moves ahead, and I don't get what Deep Blue did. And he convinced himself, persuaded himself that meant that Deep Blue could think beyond him. That because he could understand the move, that means that Deep Blue saw the position more deeply, was thinking 16 or 17 moves ahead, and played the rest of the match. There were 5 more games. Kasparov played very defensively as a result. He's an attacking player, a great aggressive player. Instead, he kind of played a wussy style of poker, or of chess rather, and lost Deep Blue as a result. It turns out, though, that in writing my book, I talked to one of Deep Blue's programmers, a guy named Murray Campbell, who's still at IBM today. What he revealed to me is that what looked at first like a random glitch actually was just a bug in Deep Blue's code. Deep Blue, very good program, very smart program. It would go on to defeat Kasparov, but there are thousands and thousands of lines of code. Not everything had been debugged, apparently, and Deep Blue had a fail-safe where in competitive chess, you're on a clock. If you time out, then you forfeit. So it said, look, if you hit a glitch in the code, then as a fail-safe, make a random legal chess move instead, just to keep the clock running. So this is a legal chess move. Of the roughly 30 legal moves, probably ranked about 28th. But it is a legal move, and it keeps the clock going, and that's what the fail-safe in the program did. But Kasparov mistook this bug for a sign of deep genius instead. So this issue, feature or bug, I'll give you one more example here. So I live in New York, what the real estate brochures describe as North Chelsea, what a lot of people call Midtown. But I live at 30th and 7th. I was going to another event recently at the Guggenheim, which is roughly 89th and 5th. So in New York, look, everything in New York is a grid in Manhattan. All the streets are numbered. How hard can it be to get to the right place? But this is the route that my taxi driver took instead. So we're passing back and forth through Central Park 3 times. We do a loop-de-loop at 68th Street and finally arrive there 45 minutes late. I know New York cabbies, actually this guy was a sedan driver, have a bad reputation, but this guy was a good dude who was following his GPS very, very religiously. The GPS wanted him to take this route, and I later figured out why. The reason is that there's a road that cuts north to south through Central Park called East Drive. It's a pretty road, the kind they film like Volvo commercials on, so a little twisty and windy. But the GPS found this route very attractive because it correctly discerned there was no traffic on it at all that day. What it forgot about is that the road was closed, which is why there was no traffic. So it kept trying to find this efficiency by desperately getting us to East Drive when it was just wasting our time instead. Now, why the driver's common sense didn't override this, I don't know. You should basically never cross Central Park twice on the same journey unless you see Godzilla on the Chrysler Building. But still, this was a case where maybe naive trust in technology wound up getting us in trouble and making us very late. So again, this is the problem with assuming that volume conquers everything. You have to apply a filter, you have to have some theory, apply some scrutiny, and there are terrific insights in the data. If you read about the book, I'll give you an example from weather forecasting later on, in politics and sports, but not without some human intelligence at the console to kind of tell the signal from the noise. So moving now from the problems into suggestions. I don't call them solutions, but they're attitudes or best practices that can help to move us forward. This, by the way, is a neon sign depicting Bayes' theorem. What Bayes' theorem is just a rather old mathematical formula telling you how to weigh new information against what you already knew before. So for example, in the context of an election, when you have 300 polls of Ohio, the 301st poll probably won't tell you very much. Your prior belief, your existing assumptions about what's occurring ought not to change that much. But for rare events, it might have more impact. So, for example, we're not really sure how frequent magnitude 9.0 earthquakes are worldwide because we only have 100 years of reliable seismological records, and these things are rare events. We don't know if they're very infrequent or extremely infrequent or what, and we just don't have a large enough sample size instead. So the earthquake in Japan, for example, or Sumatra might change your view on that quite a bit. So there are 4 kind of sub-recommendations here. You can read them, think probabilistically, know where you're coming from, survey the data landscape, and try and error. So I'll kind of go through each one briefly here. So imagine that we're not looking at an ugly PowerPoint slide, but that we're in North Dakota instead, looking at the Red River of the North, the beautiful Red River of the North, and it's springtime in North Dakota. And what happens every year in the spring is that you finally have all the snow melting, and that produces a larger volume of water. You have runoff into the streams and rivers, and you have the risk of flooding every year. So 1997 had been an especially heavy winter in the Great Plains, a lot of snow, more risk of flooding than usual. And the National Weather Service issued a forecast saying they thought the waters of the Red River would crest at a peak of 49 feet. So people in Grand Forks were a little bit worried, but they had levees that would protect them up to a crest of 51 feet instead. So no one bought insurance, really. They thought it might be kind of a close call that they would make out okay. But here's the problem. The Weather Service didn't want to tell people what the margin of error was on their forecast, which was plus or minus 9 feet instead, based on how well their spring flooding forecasts had done historically. They were afraid that if they conveyed uncertainty in the outlook, people wouldn't trust the forecast as much. This is a big problem when you see pundits on TV, where you have, some guy who, worked for the Jimmy Carter campaign on MSNBC or CNN is asked about the civil war in Syria. He knows absolutely nothing about it, but he'll give a very, very confident answer to cover for his lack of actual knowledge. People who know what they're talking about often are the first ones to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, we need more data, we'll see what happens. You don't want to be too scared to come to a conclusion, but the correlation between kind of confidence and expertise is low or maybe even negative, I think, in some fields. What actually happened here, by the way, the waters would crest at 53 feet instead, so well within the margin of error. But it did cause 3/4 of the town to flood. It was a slow-moving flood. People got out with their lives, but with the lack of insurance, you, of course, needed a big federal and state bailout as a result to repair the town. Since then, by the way, the Weather Service has gotten much better at describing and quantifying uncertainty. They work with designers and behavioral economists and psychologists to help understand how people perceive uncertainty in the data, and usually visualizing things is a lot better than just giving people numbers and a margin of error. So you see, for example, this is their forecast for Hurricane Sandy late last year, where a very basic principle is you go out in time and space, the uncertainty widens. More things could happen to the storm, so you kind of wind up with a cone shape as you move out in time. This particular forecast actually wound up being extremely accurate, though. You see this is about 4 days in advance. They nailed the exact county in New Jersey where the storm would hit, so this was a big success. And in fact, the weather forecasters have gotten much better over the years, where 25 years ago, if you had a hurricane sitting in the Gulf of Mexico about 3 days before landfall, they could only predict within about 350 miles on average where the storm might hit. So maybe if you're lucky, it might be somewhere between Houston and Tallahassee. or it could go to Mexico or South Florida or whatever else. Now the average miss is under 100 miles, so you can plausibly evacuate high-risk counties, whether in Louisiana or New Jersey or Florida or whatever else. This amount of progress is atypical, if you read my book, in some ways, to have that many tangible gains that save lives and save money every time a hurricane hits. It's partly because weather forecasters learned early on about the value of probabilistic thinking. The weather is subject to chaos theory. If you've heard chaos theory, a butterfly flaps its wings in Texas and there's a hurricane in Beijing, or I got that metaphor wrong, but something like that, right? Where small disturbances in initial conditions produce very large changes in weather patterns down the road. Chaos theory is born out of frustrated attempts to predict the weather. So weather forecasters realized early on that our predictive powers are imperfect relative to the complexity of nature. So we think in terms of probabilities as a waypoint between ignorance and knowledge. And taking that more humble attitude has actually helped them to make more progress and get a lot better instead, whereas you see stagnant progress in many other types of fields. Idea number 2 is know where you're coming from. It's a way of saying don't be biased. Of course, a lot easier said than done. But let me tell you about this map first. So we recently passed the 12th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And what people might not realize is that the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in 1941 was just as much of a shock to the American psyche as 9/11 would be 60 years later. If you look back, though, on Pearl Harbor right now, it seems almost kind of obvious, where we decided to stack almost the entirety of our Pacific fleet at one harbor in Hawaii. Maybe not a very smart idea in retrospect. It would make for a very attractive target. We were worried, ironically, back then about domestic terrorism, so there were a lot of Japanese nationals in Hawaii. People were concerned you might have sabotage. You put the ships in the open waters in Pearl Harbor where they can all be monitored by everyone. Well, a bad idea if you have an enemy attacking from across the Pacific instead. But still, moving this fleet of aircraft carriers, these things are not all that fast, really. They're very large ships, each the size of several football fields. It takes them about 2 weeks to move throughout the Pacific. So why didn't we detect them? Well, back then we didn't have global satellites. Instead, we only had reconnaissance around certain naval bases. So in Alaska, Midway Islands, Wick Atoll, Guam, and so forth. But there's a big blind spot in our defenses here. I guess you guys might say it's like UCLA secondary or whatever, where Japan kind of runs a post pattern here, exactly where we have no coverage at all, and bombs Pearl Harbor and instigates our involvement in World War II. So in many fields where you have asymmetric warfare, Imperial Japan was powerful, but our Pacific Fleet was still more powerful overall, at least until half of it was decimated. In those situations, you're often defined by your weakest link instead. In situations involving, national security or computer security, if there is some backdoor that can be hacked, then a lot of information can get out to the public on one flash drive or something. If you have Fort Knox, you have a very elaborate front door, but there's a side door that any 2-bit burglar can walk in, then the bank's still going to get robbed. So understanding what your weakest links are is often very important. A related idea here is that sometimes people who say that they have no perspective or no bias at all are often more biased instead. You might see this in news coverage, for example. So this is an example taken from Sheryl Sandberg's new book, Lean In. Sheryl Sandberg is the COO of Facebook, talks about issues involving gender in the workplace, especially in the tech community. She describes in this book an experiment that was done among hiring executives where they're given 2 sets of resumes with exactly the same credentials, but the gender of the name is changed. So you might have Jane and John, or I don't know, Marvin and Marcia or whatever. And oftentimes the female applicant is discriminated against, less likely to get a second round interview, less likely to be given a job offer despite having the same credentials. What the study found, though, is that hiring executives who said they were totally unbiased They're kind of, I'm a modern man who would never discriminate against women at all, right? Those guys actually were more likely to discriminate than the people who said, yes, gender affects my perception of candidates. I have to actively work maybe to consider that or to counterbalance that instead. So being aware that none of us has a monopoly on the truth. Objectivity in journalism means a lot of funny things, but in science it just means that the shared world that we all kind of roam around in and feel around in. Objectivity just means like truth, really, in philosophy and in science. And none of us has a monopoly on the truth. None of us, we all have a small point of view relative to the way the whole universe looks. And so acknowledging that I'm coming from a certain point of view and I'm going to act in good faith to correct that point of view as I see new evidence. That's a lot more helpful than kind of performing that assuming you're always performing a perfect kind of laboratory experiment instead as the unbiased observer. Idea number 3, survey the data landscape. So if you get in a position where you're actually working with a data set, you want to have some sense for how much that data might or might not tell you. And as I've warned you guys repeatedly, that volume alone doesn't conquer everything. So this is a chart showing the progress of American housing prices from roughly 1890 to 2005 instead. So you see how pronounced the housing bubble is. And what you had is you had financial models that the rating agencies used to look at mortgage-backed securities that were based on looking at only this period in history, a period where housing prices were always either increasing or if you had a bubble, it was a regional bubble. So in the 80s, you had some increase in the Sun States, in California, but they thought that any damage to housing prices would be a local or regional phenomenon. You might have some housing prices go down in California, but not in Florida or Maryland or Colorado or whatever else. And so you can diversify your risk away and invest in these bundles of mortgages and have them be a very safe investment. And then this happened instead, where the entire, every housing market in the country begins to collapse, and these models that claim that there was almost no risk of default for these securities, in fact, almost all of them were downgraded or defaulted instead. So as bad as losing all this housing wealth was for the country, for every dollar that was invested in a mortgage, there were about $50 of side bets in mortgage-backed securities. That's why a severe housing crisis that might have ordinarily triggered a mild recession triggered instead a near depression and a global financial crisis instead, because people were putting too much leverage on bets that were based on very optimistic assumptions despite having millions of data points. So the lesson here is that you really want 3 things at a minimum to have high quality data. Having more observations, the volume, it does help. Other things being equal, you'd have more observations than fewer, but the one on the bottom here, the variety matters as well. If you have a model that only looks at how mortgages perform in a housing price upswing, you have a sample size of 0 for what happens in a downturn instead. The model is not useful for future conditions that you may encounter. And data quality issues are important as well. In economic data, for example, you hear the monthly jobs report comes out every month. People think it's a big surprise if Wall Street predicts 100,000 jobs and you have 120,000 instead. The problem is that we can't really measure the American economy with nearly that much precision. It's hard to say how many jobs we have in the U.S., such a big and complex country. You might miss freelancers, you might miss startup industries, you might have sampling error and sampling bias in the survey, so not that easy to do. And I think anytime you have poor data explaining the present, it's very, very hard to get any better when you extrapolate into the future instead. The last idea here is what I call try and error. So there's one more diversion here about my kind of brief career as a professional poker player. So in 2003, an accountant from Nashville named Chris Moneymaker, good name for poker player, won the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas. And this is a guy who's kind of a pudgy, kind of 30-something everyman guy. He deposits $20 at an online site, PokerStars, I think, wins some qualifying tournament, wins another tournament, eventually goes to the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, pays $10,000, and wins the whole tournament, beats all these pros, gets a $2 million prize instead. So he played pretty well, got a little bit lucky, but a very good run and he became a very kind of popular figure. But in poker, like poker, I've played in the World Series poker a couple times. It's actually kind of slow and boring when you're doing it. I mean, the hands take a long time. You have a lot of amateur players. So to win the World Series of poker, you have to actually play about 60 or 70 hours of poker, I think. And this is all condensed down into about 3 hours of programming on ESPN instead. So for their protagonists like Chris Moneymaker, one thing they do is edit out all the hands they played badly. So I would love to have this product, by the way. If I had like a product where I could delete the 20% of really stupid things I do every day, I mean, I'd look really good, I would think. So you watch poker on TV and you see, well, you miss the hands where Chris Moneymaker plays like a donkey, pretty much. Second of all, when you watch poker on TV, they show you people's cards. So poker, I'll tell you, is a pretty easy game if you know exactly what your opponent has. But anyway, poker's all over TV. It's a rags to riches story. People say, well, poker is pretty easy. I can play as well as Chris Moneymaker if I delete all my bad hands and can see people's cards, and yes, I can be a great poker player. So anyway, a lot of these people were not that good, went online to play, and I was able to take some of their money as a result, just to teach them a lesson about their hubris. But anyway, while online poker, before it became even more illegal, I did some data mining on how much different players were winning and losing over the long term. So this is data from a typical 10-person table. There is a lot of luck in poker in the short term. This is looking at long-term win rates. There's a technique to guess what people are really making or losing if they played an infinite number of hands. So one thing to look at is that the very worst player at the table, this guy over here, is actually losing a lot more than the best players are making. In fact, this guy here losing about $420 an hour. If he just folded every hand, he would only lose $200 an hour instead. So by trying, he's actually making matters worse. But there are a couple of lessons here. Number one is that the context matters an awful lot. So what happens when this guy, for example, who's subsidizing, you have kind of a trickle-up economy, subsidizing all these okay players so they're winning instead of losing. Well, when he busts out, a lot of these players go underwater instead. It's the same phenomenon where it's much easier to hit for a high batting average at Fenway Park than at Dodger Stadium. It's much easier to look like a genius trader when the overall market is going up than in a bear market instead, where just breaking even might be a pretty good result for you. So another a case of where context is really key. But the main thing I want to draw from this is this learning curve that you see, where, again, in a lot of fields where you encounter significant amounts of complexity, big data types of problems, you have a learning curve that you see between accuracy and effort. So in poker, if you start out making decisions kind of at random, have no idea what you're doing, you'll lose a lot of money really fast. But learning a few basic things, so say, okay, I'm going to bet or raise with my good hands, call with my mediocre hands, and fold my bad hands. Again, not a very complicated strategy, but that alone will probably get you, about 80% of the way there. You'll be making 80% of the decisions that a world-class poker player might make. So does that make you a winning poker player, though? Well, no, not quite. The reason being that everyone else can do the easy stuff as well. So if you're the 9th best poker player in the world and the other 8 players are better than you at the same table, then you're still going to be losing your shirt most of the time. So you have to be concerned about what the water level is, where the competition is. I enjoyed being in politics because if you were able to count, then you had a big edge on the competition. But in most fields that you guys are involved in, it's a freer market. It's much more competitive, certainly in tech or in finance, where you're making your edge around the margin instead. So a lot of times people talk about big data and they want to see miracles. People are fundamentally, not all people, but many people are pretty lazy, and so you see ads for big data in trade magazines and in Harvard Business Review, whatever else. People think that, well, you get big data and then you kind of press a button on your computer and you solve all the problems for your firm or your enterprise. Well, not that easy, of course. Instead, firms that really know how to work with big data are looking for progress around the margin instead. That's where they derive their competitive advantage from. So Google, for example, Google you might think of as kind of a static product, their search, but they're actually performing thousands of experiments on their search every year. They run alpha-beta tests. They give half their users one version, half the version another. Are red pixels better than blue pixels here? Is there a different way to use location-based data? And their product is always a work in progress as a result. A lot of little wins instead of one big victory. In my book, I talked to a guy named Bob Voulgaris, who is a very successful sports gambler. He's above board. He's all doing it with scouting and statistics. Maybe the best sports bettor in the world. He still wins only about 57% of his bets against the point spread. So just getting an extra game right now and then that makes you from losing money like most sports bettors do to having $1 million profit every year instead. So looking for little wins, for progress at the margin, and being more concerned with your process instead of your results is key. This is nicely summed up by a guy named Piet Hein, who is a Danish scientist and author, who says, the road to wisdom, well, it's plain and simple to express, error and error and error again, but less and less and less. The idea here is that if you're focused on your process, not your results, and you realize that, that you're never finished as an analyst. In Bayes' theorem, you have a prior set of beliefs, you test your ideas, you incorporate new evidence, you refine to something better, but then you have your new idea and you go back and begin the cycle again. So why is data analysis hard? Well, it requires people who on the one hand have the attitude of a perfectionist, that I always want to improve and get better, and yet they also know they'll never actually achieve perfection. So it kind of requires a Zen-like peace of mind sometimes that is very difficult. But if you have that attitude, plus some of the technical skills, then you can make a lot of progress despite society as a result. So that's the end of my speech. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. Nate.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Sit down.
It's dark. It's dark
sit
here.
Sit down. It is dark in here. I wanted to thank you for a really interesting presentation. We have 5 minutes left that we have here. So if there's time for, well, maybe I'll take the question. So I'll take it from right here to save us time. So this is a speaker series on communication and policy. And you talked a lot about philosophy and theory, about statistics and data. You didn't talk much about the importance of clear communications. And I think this is actually one of the things that has made you interesting and successful. Could you just talk a little bit about how you came to the realization that communicating was actually important?
I mean, I think it's fortunate for me that I have a background that was kind of equal parts mathematical and technical, and also about communication, where I was on debate team in high school. I was on the newspaper in high school and college. I always put a lot of concern into writing my essays and writing stories. So that combination of skills, I'm like far from the best communicator in the world. I'm far from the best statistician in the world, but that overlap of skills, I think, is what characterizes 538. As we're building out the site now, it's hard to find people who both can write and communicate and can really think in a credible way about numbers and data. I think sometimes people are too compartmentalized in their thinking. You kind of have the jocks and the nerds, or the poets and the nerds at least, whereas really I think this stuff, thinking carefully about statistics requires kind of some philosophical thinking too. It's not just about numbers or technique. You have to think about what you're really doing in the bigger picture here, and also about how do you communicate to that next wider audience. I wouldn't say that 538's a mass market product exactly, but there are a lot of intelligent people who might not be specialists in politics or in sports and are coming through the front page of ESPN.com or nytimes.com, are interested in learning more, but you don't want to speak only to an audience of experts. Then you have no way to really disseminate your ideas into broader society. So
when you started 538, what did you hope to change in terms of how people think about sports and politics? And then did that actually happen? I mean, are there things that have turned out that you wouldn't have expected that you maybe wish didn't happen?
I think, I mean, at the margin, I think maybe we've made some improvements, but there's a saying in poker, which is don't berate the fish, which is that you don't want to make fun of the bad players because that's how you make all your money is from the bad players. So I probably shouldn't criticize Politico and stuff as much, because the way 538 gets traffic is because people are so sick of their idiocy that 538 looks great by comparison. But look, I think change occurs slowly. You saw in baseball a case where 10 years ago Moneyball was kind of more or less accurate, a lot of conflict between stat heads so-called and scouts. Whereas now, everyone's getting along in baseball pretty much. Almost every baseball team has someone familiar analysis somewhere on their payroll. They also recognize the value of scouting. You get a guy like Mike Trout, produces huge dividends for your team. And so people kind of get that. But baseball is unique in some ways where there's a lot of accountability in baseball because there are tangible ways to measure wins and losses. You might have a great theory in baseball. If your team's winning 62 games every year, then you're not going to keep your job for very long. In politics, where you have only one election for every 4 years, it takes much longer to actually see who is skilled at making predictions, and so it's a much slower industry to change.
Now, I wanted to go back to one thing you said in your talk. You said you always tell students not to go into politics. I work in a policy school, so I have to take exception to that. I actually think that it's more important for people to go into politics, just so that we have a diverse set of people who actually have the talent and the knowledge that you're imparting. If you were to go into politics, what would you...
Well, I would say, let me make a distinction between policy and politics. I think if you want to work, for example, for a government agency or an NGO, I think that's a respectable thing to do and a valuable thing to do. I'd say if you want to go and work for a campaign, then I wouldn't be as keen on that necessarily. And one of the issues is actually that as campaigns become more efficient, in some sense, are they just kind of pandering to voters more effectively and finding ways to manipulate the public more easily? We have an asymmetry of information sometimes, and so I worry about that. You've certainly seen the U.S. Congress become more and more partisan over the years. There's evidence that the GOP is drifting from the center faster than Democrats are, but the spread is widening in any event. Congress set a record last year for the fewest number of bills passed, I think, since the Civil War. So that's one kind of tangible measure of how efficient or how much efficiency or lack there is in the operations of government.
But some might say that efficiency is precisely because we have all this data, right? That we can use the data to draw electoral districts that make people less safe, and we get to more extreme. And maybe that recognition is an opportunity for us to think about new ways to set up our system so that we can get to the middle, try and err, and do all the things that we need to so we can make actual decisions.
Well, what's interesting is that people are segregating themselves more. So redistricting, where you draw partisan boundary lines, certainly makes matters worse. But there's also a lot of self-sorting that occurs now, where people now are picking whether they want to live in the suburbs or the city based on the politics sometimes of those locations. It used to be that, for example, the Bay Area in California was about 10% more Democratic than the country as a whole. Well, now it's about 30% more Democratic. Most major urban areas have moved that way. Rural areas have become more Republican instead. So it's kind of, there was a project recently where they had kind of maps of the U.S. where you saw at a block-by-block level what the racial composition was of people living there. And there are some cities where, like Chicago, for instance, where at a 30,000-foot level, it's like, oh, wow, the city is quite diverse. And then you hone in further even more and see block by block, it's still a very, very segregated city. Now people are not only segregating themselves by race, but also by political belief, and that makes it harder for politics to converge in the middle when so many congressional districts are very partisan instead.
Well, I think that'll be one of our challenges moving forward, to find ways to get everyone to see the same signal and understand that that's really the signal and not the noise. We're out of time. I wanted to thank you for a tremendous day. This has been really interesting. One thing for you all I did want to say, Nate was very good about how data and evidence in and of itself is not enough, and that we have to be critical and continue to use our brains to filter and make sense of this. That's an important message. Nate, you do this spectacularly every day, and you've enriched our lives and enriched our political process. I want to thank you, and thank you all for being here with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys again.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much.